Did I cause my child's food allergy? This is a question a lot of parents ask themselves. The guilt is real and it's common. But according to science, it's not warranted. Today, we're diving into the reasons why food allergies develop, what you can control, and what's out of your hands. I'm Kortney, bringing you the patient perspective, joined as always by my fabulous co-host, Dr. Payel Gupta, a board-certified allergist immunologist. Today, we're welcoming Dr. Joanne Moreau, an allergist and immunologist from Brooklyn. This podcast is made in partnership with the Allergy and Asthma Network. We want to thank Genentech and Calio for sponsoring today's episode. While they support the show, all opinions are our own and sponsorship doesn't influence our content or editorial decisions. Any mentions of brands is for informational purposes only and not an endorsement. Now, let's get to it. You're listening to The Itch, a podcast exploring all things allergy, asthma, and immunology.
Today we have a really good friend, Dr. Joanne Moreau, who I have known for years and years. She is a super specialist in food allergy. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that we hear about a lot with food allergy parents who are wondering, was this my fault? Did I cause this food allergy? So let's jump into it. Joanne, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So my name is Joanne Moreau, and I'm a practicing allergist in Brooklyn, New York. According to my parents, I had started saying that I wanted to be a baby doctor from the time I was in elementary school. And I did a pediatric residency. And it was actually during my second year of pediatrics residency that I actually did an allergy rotation. And then I was actually struck by the type of relationships that the allergist and the patients had. And it just was surprising, like how close that specialist relationship was and how that kind of mirrored the primary care relationship, which I thought was really, really cool. And I went to University of Rochester. It's really big at that school. They talk about the biopsychosocial model. And what that means is that you don't treat patients in a vacuum. Every decision that they make is impacted by other things in their lives. And so whether they decide to implement something that I advise them to do is impacted by financial costs, what they think, what their friends think, what their family thinks, what they think is actually feasible. And then just realizing that shared decision making is a very important thing to take into account when we interact with our patients. And allergy is just so cool because it evolves so rapidly that I have to stay on top of things. So this way I can explain things to my patients. And then my patients have to actually understand what I'm saying. And then we together come up with a plan that works best for them. So that's a little detour of like how I became an allergist.
Wonderful. And now you practice at Latitude, which is a food allergy center where you do oral immunotherapy and all things food allergy.
Yes, that's correct.
Let's get into today's topic, which is when a parent finds out that their child has a food allergy. One of the many things that we hear them say is, did I do something wrong? What do you tell the parents of your food allergic kids when they ask that question?
Probably the first thing I would say is that you didn't do anything wrong. And then the important part is that you're here. I think that's the first thing, is just giving them that sense. There is nothing that you did that was incorrect. Your child is alive. Your child is happy. They're fed. They have people that love them. That's the first battle. You're now here. This is going to hopefully be a judge-free zone. It's going to be a guilt-free zone. And we're going to try and help you get through this process.
And how do you help them understand that it wasn't their fault? And I can just say that, so I was diagnosed with food allergies in 1989. And when the new guidelines came out about early introduction, my mom looked at me and she's like, oh, I totally gave you food allergies. And then she's also like, oh, I totally gave you food allergies because I used to eat peanut butter sandwiches over you when I was holding you. So my mom, 30 something years later, feels a lot of guilt because of all of the research that comes out. So how do you tell parents that it wasn't their fault?
Yeah, and that's so hard. And we try to do a lot of unpacking and just really telling parents, like, it wasn't your fault. We've seen it go in so many different ways. We have the moms that ate the top allergens in an effort to try and prevent allergies, and their kids have food allergies. And then I have the moms who avoided the top allergens and their kids have allergies. So at the end of the day, it's a combination genetics and environment. Genetics do contribute. They're not 100% of the issue. And then environment, it does contribute. Again, not 100% of the issue, but clearly we're still working out the kinks of everything. And so at the end of the day, you can't blame yourself for what's happening because science also gets it wrong. If you look at what we say 20 years ago versus 15, 10, 5, we're always evolving, we're always changing. We're not always going to get it right. But then the important thing is once we do hear of new research, then we're going to try to apply that and do what we can to deal with the situation that we're dealing with at that time. For example, I'll have parents who come in and say, well, we had to do antibiotics and they probably shouldn't have given antibiotics. We didn't need the antibiotics at the time. And well, at the time, your doctor felt like you needed them. The risk of an infection during a neonatal period, that you're not trying to do that. You're not trying to have to do spinal taps and all that other stuff. Like you needed those antibiotics. And so again, we can deal with that. Or maybe they got anti-reflux medications because they felt it was needed. Or maybe they were born via C-section because again, they thought that that was needed. All three of those things could potentially affect the microbiome and affect the gut. And we're learning more and more that gut health and the microbiome is very important when it comes to defending us and protecting us against allergies. But in those cases, it wasn't controllable at that time. I think now people are more mindful about the healthcare decisions that are being made, but it's still a work in progress and still evolving. There's also food introduction. A lot of people are aware that early introduction is key, but there's some work to be done because I still have some people who don't know that they need to be giving foods, or they still think that you need to give it after 1 year of age, or certain foods are okay, but then other foods aren't okay. So there's just a lot of things contributing. There's also the hygiene hypothesis. There's a thought that, we're just too clean nowadays. Like before, our foods were less processed. It was farm to table. You grew it, you ate it. And now it goes through all these different processing steps. We don't know how that impacts our immune system completely, but we know that we have the same immune system that we had centuries and thousands of years ago. So those helmets and parasites no longer exist, but our immune system is still there and it's looking for things to take out. We also have like microplastics, nanoplastics. We don't know how that affects, but it might disrupt our gut barrier. So I feel like we're just continuing to learn and we're just doing the best that we can. But at the end of the day, there are multiple reasons why some people will have food allergies and why some people won't.
So it sounds like there are things that happen before the baby is born. So what's going on in the mom? And that's where moms kind of blame themselves. Did I not eat enough vegetables? Did I eat too many of the allergen? That's also genetic too, right? Like I would say before the baby is born, the genetic component comes into play, which we didn't really talk about. So I'd love to unpack that. But then the other aspect that we talked about was what happens once the baby is born and all of the different factors that go into potentially developing food allergies. But if you don't mind, if we can just take a little step back and talk about the genetic factor.
So in terms of the genetics factor, genetics clearly do play a role. So if you have one parent who has food allergies, environmental allergies, asthma, eczema, then your child is about 30 to 50% likely to have any one of those things. And then if it's both parents, it can go up as high as 80%. So clearly there is a genetic component. The interesting thing though is that I'll have parents who say, well, I don't have food allergies, so I don't understand how my kid has food allergies. And it's like, well, you have asthma, and then the other parent has eczema. And so that just combined to make a food allergy baby. Atopy is all linked. And it's just that in your bodies, it just decided that it just needed to make more IgE. You're just more predisposed to that. But then the interesting thing is for the parents who do have food allergies, they're like, well, I have a peanut allergy. So I'm really worried that they're going to have a peanut allergy. And I always have to tell them, well, it's not necessarily a one-to-one thing. So you could potentially have a peanut allergy, but maybe your child has a shellfish allergy, or maybe your child has no food allergy. So you shouldn't necessarily be afraid to introduce a food because of your food allergy. But I do understand for some parents, it can be scary giving a food because they know what it's been like to grow up with that food and having that food allergy.
Thank you, Joanne, for all of that. So it sounds like, as far as genetics go, I just wanted to talk about the atopy that you mentioned. So atopy is a term that we use for allergy or allergic conditions. With atopy, the conditions that we're talking about are classically things like allergic rhinitis, asthma, eczema, and food allergy. And so when you have one of these conditions, that means you're an atopic person. And you can have one of those or you can have all of them. For example, I have a bunch of those. Kortney has a bunch of those. I don't know, Joanne, if you have any of those, but people who have these conditions, they tend to go hand in hand. And it's because of the underlying immune process that's happening in the body. And what we know, as you mentioned, Joanna, is that if a parent has any of these atopic conditions, then their kids are more likely to have these atopic conditions. And it's not a one-to-one. So it's not the parent has eczema, the kid is more likely to only have eczema. They are just more likely to have any of those atopic conditions. So that's the genetic aspect. But then you also talked about the microbiome. That is a newer topic that we definitely want to do a dedicated episode on. But essentially, can you just talk quickly about what you mean about the microbiome? And you mentioned a C-section, you mentioned getting antibiotics, you mentioned acid reflux. And so all of these external factors can affect that microbiome. So if we could just quickly talk about that.
Sure. So your microbiome is comprised of billions, if not trillions, of bacteria, viruses, fungi that live both in our body, on our body. And it just actually helps to function as like an extension of our immune system. It helps regulate our immunity and it protects against pathogens. We're just learning more and more about how it functions and how any kind of disruption within our microbiome can lead to different types of diagnoses. One of them being food allergies. There has been some link to obesity, potentially eczema can be impacted by it. And so we're learning more and more about it. And so the goal nowadays is to actually keep our microbiome as intact as possible. And so that's why nowadays, like in the NICUs, we're not necessarily rushing to put people and babies on antibiotics if it's not necessarily needed. We're not trying to put reflex medications on board. And then with C-sections, we're trying to move away from elective C-sections, not only due to the fact that there is always a risk when it comes to surgeries and anesthesia, but just that flora that a baby's typically exposed to when they're born vaginally is actually helpful and protective. And so whatever we can do to actually maintain that is helpful. So we're trying to do as much as possible to keep it as close to nature as possible.
So now we've talked about genetics, we've talked about the microbiome. The next thing that we want to get into is diet. So you mentioned starting foods and when to start them and early introduction. And also you mentioned pregnancy and what foods the mom is eating during her pregnancy. So can you just quickly talk first about the pregnancy aspect and what we know about how that actually affects food allergies and what we actually don't know about how that affects food allergy? There's a lot of question marks. And then two, about early introduction.
Yeah. So in terms of pregnancy and what moms are eating, we actually don't have any conclusive data about what's the best diet to follow. And so basically that's why we tell the moms, just eat whatever you would like to eat. Just try to keep it as nutritious or healthy as possible. But at the end of the day, eating more of the allergenic foods does not seem to be protective at this time. And then eating less of the allergenic foods don't seem to be protective at this time. So it's just eat what you would like to eat, just making sure that it's as balanced, as nutritious as possible. That being said, there actually is a trial that's currently enrolling. It's the ESCAPE trial, and they're trying to look specifically at the maternal diet to see if there actually is a difference. So the way the study is designed is that they're enrolling moms, and then what they're going to do is in the third trimester of pregnancy, they're going to actually be encouraging the consumption of peanut and egg. And then, so that's going to be the group that they're looking at the most. And then they're going to have a control group where they're not necessarily ingesting those things, at least on a regular basis. And then they're going to follow these moms for at least 1 year after the baby delivers. And so once the baby's delivered, both groups are actually going to be encouraged to breastfeed, but they have to breastfeed for at least 3 months. And then this way they can extrapolate and see, okay, if we're very diligent about maintaining some of the allergens in the diet versus not having the allergens in the diet in coordination with breastfeeding, do we actually see a difference in those babies after 1 year of life? And so I think that's going to be interesting because then we'll actually have a controlled group of moms to see, does anything actually bear out?
That's really interesting to hear about the breastfeeding because I also know that that's kind of this weird guilty feeling that a lot of moms might experience of I didn't breastfeed my child, I wasn't able to. Is that a reason why they got food allergies? Is that something that we have any data on?
So at this point, no. So it can be protective when it comes to eczema, but not necessarily for food allergies. But breastfeeding in general is very helpful because you're passing antibodies and you're building up that immunity. But at the same time, that can also be a source of guilt for a lot of my patients because some people just aren't able to breastfeed. And so you do what you can with what you have, but just know if you can breastfeed, that's great. But if you can't breastfeed, that's also okay too.
Yeah, I went through that journey and I've been really open about that. And it was very difficult and it definitely caused a lot of anxiety in those early days of mothering for me. And so breastfeeding may have some protective immunity, et cetera, but there are lots of babies that are not breastfed and they are totally healthy and thriving and also don't have allergic disease. So again, it's one factor in many factors that could make a difference in food allergy, in asthma, and eczema, all of those things. But it's just one little piece in that puzzle. And that took a lot of learning for me. And so I always want to share that because I think that so many moms feel so much guilt, and especially doctor moms, because we know all the data and we know everything. And so we start getting in our head about it. But ultimately, it's just one little piece in a bigger picture of the human body. And your child can still thrive if the breastfeeding journey wasn't right for you from any reason, right? If you just didn't feel like it, if it wasn't working for you mentally to breastfeed your child. So sometimes your body can do it, but your mind can't. And so there's so many different reasons that contribute to people not being able to breastfeed.
And then some hospitals actually have donor breast milk available for some of the infants who are in the hospital so they can actually get breast milk from other moms if they feel it's indicated as well.
Absolutely. Donor breast milk is also there, but it's very expensive. I looked into that too. So you have to be able to afford to give donor breast milk to your child.
Access. It all comes down to access when it comes to food allergies, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for explaining the role of breast milk in food allergy and why moms shouldn't be feeling guilty if they were able to breastfeed or not. Can we go into early introduction? So the baby is now outside of the body and they're about to be introduced to foods. Can we talk about early introduction?
So, we're going to talk about food introduction a little bit later, but first we're going to backtrack and talk about how these allergies potentially develop. The important thing to recognize is that there are different ways of our body recognizing different things. And then, depending on how the baby recognizes these things when they're first born, that determines the pathway that they're going to go down. So, for example, if their immune system happens to see food, peanut, it can decide at that time, is peanut friendly or is peanut not friendly? If it decides that peanut is friendly upon recognizing it, then the baby's going to be able to eat it and not have any issue, and your immune system is not involved, at least not in a negative way. Because that's the thing, whether it recognizes it or doesn't recognize it is not necessarily the issue, it's what it does with that recognition. If your body decides at the time that is an infant that peanut is the enemy, then what happens that a lot of inflammation happens, and then we get this production of an antibody called IgE, which people may be familiar with. IgE is a protein that is very much associated with allergies and allergic disease. If you have a prevalence and an increased amount of IgE, you can have a lot of allergic disease, food allergy being one of them. I can liken it to the fact of if you're on your block, you can see somebody going down the street. You don't necessarily have a problem with that person. You recognize that person. They're perfectly fine to go their own way. You can see another person go down the block, or maybe a group of people going down the block, and then you feel a little bit more scared about that. You'll call the police, and the police will go off. They'll escalate the situation and then take care of that issue. So the same thing happens for our babies, or sometimes a little bit older than our babies, but we're more concerned about the babies, where they are being introduced to foods early on in their life, hopefully based on the recommendations that they're getting from their allergist and their pediatrician. So this way we can try to steer more and more people towards the route of recognition, but without calling the police, as opposed to recognition and you are calling the police. Because When you call the police, that's when you get this increased inflammation. That's when you get a lot of the histamine production. And it's the histamine production and the other things that are being produced that actually cause anaphylaxis. It causes hives, it causes wheezing. And so it's not just the food that you're exposing, but it's also the reaction that your body is having to the food. And our goal, therefore, is to actually try to introduce all these foods earlier rather than later, because science has shown that if you introduce these potentially allergic foods earlier rather than later, you're less likely to potentially call the police. You're less likely for inflammation to occur. But if you wait too long, if you see that group of people coming and you don't know who they are, the police have been called. Like there's just no waiting, we're just too far gone. And so we're trying to stop that whole inflammatory response from happening in the first place.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that you want to, through early introduction, show the people walking down the street or the allergens, the top allergens, aren't dangerous, that they're okay. But my question for you is like these babies that come in really, really early having allergic reactions. Why is that happening if they haven't been introduced that food necessarily through their mouth?
There are some babies who have really severe eczema. And as I said before, that's actually one of the pathways where some of these proteins can actually get into the skin. Because when you have eczema, you actually have open areas. So in theory, if you have nice, healthy skin, then everything is closed, it's sealed up, there's moisture. It actually functions as a great barrier to the outside world. However, if you have eczema, then you actually have these cracks, these openings. And the problem is when you have these cracks and openings, sometimes you can also have inflammation associated with those cracks and openings. And so that means that you have a lot of these cells that are sitting there trying to repair the skin because there's damage to the skin. And so for them, damage is bad. So when you then add a protein, which in other ways, like if you had eaten it, it would be perfectly fine. But when presented to the skin where there's ongoing inflammation, sometimes that protein, which is not necessarily a problem, gets interpreted as being a problem because it's being presented at the same time as all the inflammation. Your body is now negatively reacting to something that it shouldn't have reacted to. And so even though you haven't eaten that food, you've now applied that food to a place of inflammation, and now you can develop allergies. So that's why a lot of the times, like I'll have families come in and they say, oh, well, I just apply, this food-based ointment to the skin. And even though that might be acceptable for kids who don't have eczema, for patients that do have eczema, you can actually be what we call sensitizing them to that food and actually developing allergies without actually having eaten it. So you will establish tolerance if you eat it. So tolerance meaning that you can eat the food, your body recognizes the food as present, but it's not a problem, as opposed to allergy when you actually expose it in another route where inflammation is present. And so our goal is always to establish tolerance as opposed to inflammation when it comes to foods.
That was the best description of skin barrier that I've heard, I have to say, because I always just imagined it in a different way. I'd love to just clarify and see if actually what I'm hearing is actually what I'm understanding. So basically what's happening is kids or babies who have eczema, their skin's inflamed. So that means that their immune system is working, right? And when a protein from an allergen gets introduced to that working inflammation, it gets mixed up, say, as something that's a threat because the inflammation is ongoing. So the immune system is recognizing something to make sure that like they're fighting the problem that the eczema is creating. But then the allergen comes in and it just kind of, I hope I'm not using this term incorrectly, but almost gets like crosswired in the sense that it's now seeing this protein as a threat because it's already so like aggravated. And so anything that comes into it is a threat. So I'm thinking of like a mob and like someone could come in and be like, you guys, let's chill out. But the mob is so crazy that they're like, don't come and bother us either. And they swoop you in to that mob, which would basically be the inflammation. But if that protein was originally introduced through the mouth, like how you would normally meet it, then there's no inflammation there, right? So the immune system isn't already adding it into a problem category. I hope that made sense.
It does make sense. It's just like if you're part of the food and you're in the mix with all this other inflammation going on, your body does not have the time to think about, oh, like, okay, you were friendly, you were not friendly. It's like, oh no, you were presented as part of the problem, so you are the problem. So we are going to fight everything that's here, as opposed to when you eat it, you're actually building tolerance in so many different ways that it's less likely for you to develop allergies by eating as opposed to topical application.
So that's basically what happened is my mom. So basically my mom loves peanut butter. And so she now thinks that because I had severe eczema as a baby, like very early on, she used to hold me and eat peanut butter sandwiches over me. And so she's like, this is how you develop your peanut allergy. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, everyone's atopic in my family. So two grandmas with asthma, a grandpa with asthma. One of my grandmas also has eczema, so it's like all of these compounding factors. So it wasn't my mom and the peanut butter sandwich necessarily.
Exactly. It's one of those things like it's true, and could have been related, but it may not have been related. And so that's the tricky part, is that we just never know. And so that's why it's not worth it to go back and think of like what ifs and, if I had only done this and I had only done that. Because at the end of the day, we just don't know. Because there are people who quote unquote do all the right things, and their kids still have food allergies. So clearly there are other mechanisms and pathways that are contributing that we have yet to identify. So the guilt carrying, the I need to do better and I wasn't good enough, it's just not worth it. And it just adds so much stress, and it's just such a heavy load to carry. And then that load that the parents carry, kids feel that. They're aware of that. And then sometimes I see that there's guilt on behalf of the kids because they feel bad that they developed a food allergy. And then maybe if I had done something different, I wouldn't have it. So there are just layers to it. And at the end of the day, it's just no, there's no guilt here. There's nothing that you can do. It's just, this is where we're at. And then this is how we're going to move forward. And then that's it. This is just a new set point. We can't do anything about what happened in the past. We're just going to move forward.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, especially in this episode where we're trying to help parents understand what is and isn't in their control. So far in this episode, we've really talked a lot about factors that are out of our control. So the genetics, the microbiome, whether you get a C-section or not, whether you're able to breastfeed or not, did you eat food allergens during your pregnancy or not? And we don't know. That's a question mark, whether or not it makes a difference or not. But what we do know, and that's what we're kind of getting into now, is that early introduction of food allergens can make a difference. And also good eczema care and making sure that skin barrier is intact can make a difference in whether or not food allergies develop or they don't. That is the reason that the allergy community is on this education spree. It's been so important to us that the pediatricians, that everyone understand that early introduction and good eczema care is important and can potentially help us reduce the number of people with food allergy. And so that is where there's no guilt ever. But the more we know, the more we're able to hopefully make a dent in this food allergy epidemic that we've been facing. This is one of those areas that we can potentially make a difference. And even if you do early introduction, that baby might already actually be allergic to that food. And that's what we determine when we're doing that early introduction. But trying to do early introduction and making sure that we are getting those foods in early, we know does benefit the immune system and how it reacts to these foods, and making sure that that skin barrier is intact and not able to react to food through the skin is also important. However, you could do everything right and that baby could still develop a food allergy. And I think that's the key message that we want to get across, is that there are so many different factors playing a role in how somebody develops a food allergy that we can only control what we have control over. And if for whatever reason you didn't do early introduction because you didn't know about it, it's okay, because your child may have developed a food allergy either way, but it could have helped, but we're really not sure. And so I think that's the key message for me that I really want to make sure that parents understand.
I feel like that's really the key thing, because right now, I would say about 8% of children in the US have diagnosed food allergies. And it's a really expensive disease to have. It's thought that it costs about $24 billion in the United States just for having food allergies. And that roughly comes out to about $4,000 per child. And that is a lot of money. And so we're trying to do as much as we can to bring down the prevalence of food allergies in the United States. And then some of it was due to bad recommendations back in the day. So from about the late 90s to like the early 2000s, we were actually having parents delay food introduction when it came to the allergic foods because we thought that that would actually be helpful. And then the rates of food allergies actually tripled during that time. And I was like, oh, wait, wrong advice. That was not great. But then we learned from it. And so we then discovered that no, early food introduction is the way to go. The landmark paper was the LEAP trial led by Gideon Lack. The way that that actually came about from what he said is that there was a high incidence of peanut allergy in the United Kingdom. And then he had gone to Israel and then he was asking them like what they were doing about their peanut allergy incidents. And then the response was, well, we don't really have peanut allergy issues over here. And I was just like, wait, what? Like, what are you talking about? And it turned out that most of the babies were getting peanut snacks during teething. Then he postulated, well, if they're getting peanut snacks for teething, well, maybe that's actually helping and that's deriving some kind of protected benefit. So then he designed a study that took place in the United Kingdom where he enrolled patients between 4 and 11 months of age. And some of them were exposed to peanut, and then some of them were not necessarily avoiding, but didn't necessarily get peanut. And then he found a significant difference between those that were getting peanut versus those that were not getting peanut. That indicated that, we actually do need to introduce foods early to our kids and that it actually makes a difference. So we can actually impact outcomes if we actually introduce foods earlier. And so this way we don't get that kind of immune response that we had spoken about earlier. It was, I believe, like an 80% difference between the kids who were exposed to peanut versus the ones who weren't in terms of developing food allergies. And then there were a number of other trials that actually followed. There was also the EAT trial, and then that actually involved introducing things like milk, egg, peanut, sesame, wheat, and then also found that there was a reduction specifically in peanut and egg. And so now that we've had more and more studies indicate that early introduction can actually prevent food allergies, we're doing our best to get out there and spread the word that you really do need to try to introduce foods to your kids between 4 and 11 months of age. And the data that has recently come out has said trying to skew it more between 4 and 6. There's actually one study out of Japan, the Petite study, where they actually started doing egg introduction at 3 months of age. And I was like, wow, that showed a significant reduction. But definitely early is better because even if you introduce at around 8, 9, 10, or 11 months of age, the prevention effect actually does go down with time. So introducing earlier rather than later actually is better. But I'd rather you introduce at 11 months than introduce at 15 months. So that's why when parents come in and they feel guilty, like, oh, is it too late? Well, it's not too late because now you're here and you're looking to do something about it. So yes, we want to introduce as early as possible, but you can only do stuff when you know to do stuff. So if you aren't told, you can't do anything about that. So it's having that knowledge and just talking to people in the community. So if you know about this and you have a friend who just gave birth, then just letting them know. Don't just assume that people know about this. Spread the word and say, hey, please remember to introduce these foods. And subsequent studies have also found that it's not just introducing the foods, it's maintaining the foods in the diet, because that's also been a big issue for some of my patients where they're like, well, I gave it at 4 months like I was supposed to, but then they still had allergies. And then I talked to them further and it turns out that they gave it that one time or maybe 3 times successively, but then didn't give it after that. And so consistency is also key. So not only do you want to introduce it, you want to maintain it on a regular basis. So this way that immune system is seeing that as its friend. So it's like, oh, I see that person run down the block every single day. I know that they're a friend. So just going back to that idea of building up tolerance. So you as the person living in your house, seeing that person going down the street, that's actually your tolerance. You now know that person goes down the block. They're not you. They don't live on your block, but they're friendly. So that's okay. So it's the same thing that's happening with the food. Your body's seeing it on a regular basis. And it's like, you know what? You're friendly. We're going to let that go. We're not going to build up an immune response to that food.
Thank you so much for for explaining why we want to introduce early. And I do know that we have some podcasts kind of going into more detail, so I'll make sure that we link those in the show notes. The one question I do have, because we haven't really dived into this protecting the skin barrier aspect, what does that mean? How long do you have to protect that skin barrier? Is it for all babies or just babies who might have atopic parents? Can you just kind of give us the lay of the lands?
So maintaining the skin barrier is very important, but interestingly, maintaining the skin barrier by itself isn't necessarily going to be protective against food allergies because eczema and food allergies coexist. It's not necessarily that food allergies will cause eczema flares, but we do see them happen in tandem. I would say the important thing is to decrease the inflammation that's happening. And so this way, you're not having that inflammatory process and then all this extra cells coming to the forefront. And so one of the ways to make sure that we're decreasing inflammation or in some ways preventing it is to apply topical steroids. That's something that could be very controversial for patients, like they don't want to use steroids. But the problem is if the inflammation goes on unchecked, then the eczema actually is a risk factor for developing food allergies. So for patients who have severe eczema, I think it's 67% more likely to have food allergies if you have severe eczema. So you really want to get the eczema under control. So therefore, you're less likely to develop food allergies. And so nobody's saying that you have to be on these topical steroids forever, but we at least want to get that inflammation under control. So this way you have less of an opening for food proteins to potentially get in. So this way you're not sensitized. And so you don't develop the food allergy that way. Because as we said, we want food proteins to be introduced via eating, not via skin. And so having intact skin will actually protect you against having food allergies. And in theory, you want to maintain skin health lifelong. That doesn't necessarily mean that you'll need topical steroids lifelong. And in a lot of cases, even if you do need topical steroids, it's usually not an everyday endeavor where you're going to have to do steroids indefinitely for the rest of your life or every day, but you potentially could have flares and different things will cause the flares. Sometimes it's going to be heat, sometimes it's going to be stress. So you might have to use the topical steroids as needed, but they will be helpful for you in the long run. And so it's just a short burst. So it's kind of like with asthma, like people don't necessarily want to use steroids, but sometimes we'll use inhaled steroids. So this way we don't have to do the systemic ones, which will then have the potent effect. So we're trying to keep everything as local as possible. So this way we do more good than harm.
Thank you, Joanne, for helping us understand how important keeping the skin barrier intact is. Growing up with eczema and being on topical steroids for a long time, I am also excited because there's so many other types of medication that can keep your eczema under control. So there are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications. There's also biologics for infants as young as 6 months who have really severe eczema. So there's so many different ways of keeping that barrier intact. And the key thing that Joanne and I really want to get across to everyone is that it is really important to do those things and to make sure that that skin barrier stays intact, not only for food allergies, but also because that ongoing inflammation can lead to infection. It can lead to discoloration of the skin. It can lead to something called like lichenification, which means that the skin gets thicker, and that's really hard to get rid of. So there's so many different aspects to eczema and the downward spiral that it can cause to our overall health that is important. And even not to mention the lack of sleep from the itch rash cycle. So children not sleeping can affect their schoolwork, can affect their performance, can affect their overall development. I had a patient who was only 3 years old that came in and he was acting like he was more like a 1.5-year-old because he really couldn't concentrate on anything but his skin and how uncomfortable he was. And after we put him on the appropriate therapy and he came back in, he was a totally different kid. He was a 3-year-old. He was curious about his environment. He was curious about me. He was curious about everything around him and not just focused on his skin. And so it's not only important for food allergy, but it's overall important to take care of eczema appropriately?
Sometimes you can think that a child is not achieving their appropriate milestones, and it's just because their eczema is just so poorly controlled that they're so in tune with themselves and how they're feeling, like they just cannot interact with the outside world. They're just so itchy and so miserable. And then once you do get them under control, you really do see their personalities come out. And I've actually seen cases where babies' eczema is so bad, like they'll actually scratch their parents because they know like how good it feels for them. And so they'll scratch them as a sign of, I love you and I'm taking care of you because the scratch feels good. That kind of imprinting and learning happens pretty early. So getting it under control is key.
Thank you for sharing that. That really makes me so sad to hear that the child felt like a form of infection was scratching, because that's what makes them feel good. It kind of warms your heart. What makes me feel good, I want you to feel good. And that's what that baby was basically showing their parents through scratching. But that's not the right reason we want a baby to scratch their parents, you know? So we talked about the babies that do have eczema, but what about babies who do not present with eczema? Do we also want to do something to maintain their skin barrier? What is that journey for parents who don't see inflammation but are concerned?
Yeah, so usually for the patients who don't have eczema, you don't have to do like this vigorous moisturizing process. And so they don't necessarily require it to the same extent. There have actually been some studies that show that if you moisturize too much, you can actually develop issues. So it's primarily been shown that it's primarily for the patients who have eczema that you want to be really diligent about maintaining that barrier.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moreau, for sharing all of your beautiful knowledge with us. I would like to just emphasize what I've heard, and I'm looking at you, Mom. It's not your fault, right? Whatever you did when I was in your tummy, it wasn't your fault. Whatever you did while I was a baby, it wasn't your fault, because there are so many things at play, right? There are so many different things that could lend to a food allergy developing. What we do know, however, is that there are things that we can do to help maybe the baby not get the food allergy, right? And that's the early introduction, and that's maintaining a healthy, happy skin barrier if you do see inflammation. So if you do see eczema. But again, we can do everything in our power to try and prevent a food allergy, and it might just come. So it's multifactorial, as I've said before. And so it's not your fault, and we cannot blame ourselves. And I always say this to everyone as someone who's lived their whole life with food allergies. And as someone who has been asked whether I didn't want to have kids because they could potentially have food allergies, are you childless because of this? I've actually been asked that. So what I say to them is, I honestly think that we are living in the best time right now to have any food allergies, because there's so much research going on. There are so many positive doctors out there who are helping kids with food allergies that we're really lucky where we are now with the science. So I think any parent who's been put in a weird position like I have and asked that question, we are living in a golden era for kids with food allergies, and that's kind of the last word I'd like to leave with. Dr. Moreau, do you have any last words for our listeners?
Things that I would say is important is that it's never too late. I really want parents to embrace that and just know it's not too late. The second one I would say is we're here to help and not judge. Because I think there are some parents who come in and they're like, I know, it was my fault, I'm sorry. And it's just, I'm not here to judge you. You're here. You made that decision to come here. And that's the first step. So we're here to help you and help find the right plan that works for you. So you may know somebody else who has food allergies and they have a certain treatment plan, but that might not necessarily be the treatment plan that suits your needs, what you desire, what your ultimate goal is. And so we're going to have to talk through that and come up with that plan together. And then I would say the third thing is just not necessarily for food allergy patients and their families, but just for everybody in general to just have a little bit more empathy towards people who are living with food allergies or know people who have food allergies. I think we all got a kind of a taste of what that was like during COVID. Because during COVID, there was a small particle that was around that everybody was afraid of. And the world for many of us essentially shut down. We didn't go out. We didn't socialize. We were all afraid. This is bad. I could potentially die at any moment and all this other stuff. But then the world opened up. And then the majority of us got to come out of it and we were okay. But the families who deal with food allergies still deal with that fear of a small particle that can cause stress, anxiety, fear. And then for them, that's food. And our lives revolve around food in so many different ways. Like most of the ways that we get together, parties, celebrations, they revolve around food. If you travel, you have to think about food. And so just having a little bit more empathy for people who are going through that, a little bit more grace and understanding, I think will help go a long way.
Thank you so much, Jo, for helping our allergy parents feel less stressed.
Appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Remember that all information you hear today is for informational purposes only and are not intended to serve as a substitute for the consultation, diagnosis, and/or medical treatment of a qualified physician or healthcare provider. And also, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. And if you have a second, help spread the word by rating our podcast and sharing with your friends and family who might also be interested in learning more about allergies, asthma, and immunology. You can always stay up to date by checking out our Instagram, The Itch Podcast, where you can leave questions you are itching to know, or check out our website, which is www.itchpodcast.com, which contains more information about the subjects we covered in today's episode and every episode. Until next time, have a fabulous week.